April 12, 1968. Somewhere beneath the red clay of Quang Tri Province, a Viet Cong supply officer checked his watch by candlelight, unaware that 200 feet above him, a sensor no larger than a rifle shell had just detected his heartbeat. The Americans called it electronic warfare. The North Vietnamese called it witchcraft. Subscribe to our channel for more untold stories of Vietnam's invisible war. 3 years earlier, the war looked entirely different. December 1968, Thai Ninh Province. An American patrol moved through elephant grass still wet from monsoon rains, rifles ready, eyes scanning tree lines that revealed nothing. Lieutenant James Kozlowski had been in country for 6 months, long enough to know the sickening pattern. Contact, fire, silence, and then nothing but empty jungle and a tunnel entrance still radiating body heat. They found 3 fighting positions, a rice cache and a medical station, all abandoned within the last hour. The tunnel mouth yawned at them like a dark throat, swallowing any hope of pursuit. Kozlowski radioed coordinates, requested artillery, and watched smoke rise from grid squares that probably held nothing anymore. The enemy had simply dissolved into the earth. This wasn't war as Americans understood it. There were no front lines, no territorial objectives, no massed formations to destroy. The Viet Cong appeared from nowhere, struck with intimate knowledge of American positions, then vanished into a subterranean world that reconnaissance aircraft couldn't photograph and ground troops couldn't follow. Intelligence reports spoke of tunnel networks stretching for miles beneath seemingly peaceful villages, Ho Chi, the Iron Triangle. Entire underground cities where the enemy lived, stored weapons, treated wounded, and planned operations in complete invisibility. By early 1966, frustration had metastasized into strategic crisis. General William Westmoreland's search and destroy operations were destroying plenty of jungle but finding precious few enemy soldiers. Body counts looked impressive on paper. The war looked unwinnable on the ground. And 8,000 miles north, along the Laotian Panhandle, an even more maddening problem was bleeding American credibility. The Ho Chi Minh Trail wasn't a trail. It was a circulatory system, a network of roads, paths, and waterways pumping men and material south into the war zone. American bombers pounded it relentlessly. Rolling thunder, arc light, thousands of sorties dropping hundreds of thousands of tons of ordnance onto jungle canopy. Pilots reported secondary explosions, destroyed trucks, shattered bridges. Intelligence analysts nodded approvingly at strike photos showing cratered roads and splintered trees. The supplies kept coming. Every week, more weapons appeared in the hands of VC guerrillas. More ammunition, more rockets for attacks on American bases. The trail was a wound that wouldn't close, and conventional bombing was proving as effective as shooting at shadows. In Washington, Defense Secretary Robert McNamara assembled a team. Not generals or colonels, but scientists. The Defense Communications Planning Group formed quietly in 1966, staffed by physicists and engineers from the Institute for Defense Analyses Jason Division. These were men accustomed to impossible problems: nuclear weapon design, ballistic missile defense, submarine detection. McNamara gave them the trail and told them to think differently. What emerged was radical. If you couldn't see the enemy, perhaps you could hear him. If aerial reconnaissance missed camouflaged convoys beneath triple canopy jungle, perhaps the ground itself could reveal their presence. The scientists proposed an electronic fence, a barrier made not of wire and concrete, but of listening devices scattered across the trail like seeds. The sensors themselves seemed impossibly small for such an ambitious task. The air-delivered Seismic Intrusion Detector, ADSID for short, looked like a small artillery shell painted jungle green, 25 pounds, 3 feet long, packed with a geophone that sensed ground vibrations, a radio transmitter, and batteries designed to last months in tropical humidity. The design was elegant in its simplicity. Drop them from aircraft. Let them fall. A small parachute would deploy, slowing descent just enough that the pointed nose buried itself in soft jungle soil. The antenna, disguised as tropical foliage, would stick up like a fern or small plant. To anyone walking past, it looked like vegetation. Its acoustic cousin, the ADSID, listened instead for sound, engine noise, human voices, the mechanical clatter of truck convoys grinding through the night. Together, they would form a network, a web of electronic tripwires that would trigger whenever the enemy moved beneath them. The military brass was skeptical. Generals who'd commanded divisions in World War II and Korea couldn't fathom how unmanned sensors could replace trained scouts. The technology felt too theoretical, too detached from the mud and blood reality of jungle warfare. But McNamara had the president's ear, and the president wanted results. Operation Igloo White received funding, approval, and a deadline. Task Force Alpha would be the brain. Nakhon Phanom Royal Thai Air Base, nestled against the Mekong River in northeastern Thailand, became the nerve center. Engineers installed IBM 360-65 computers, the most advanced data processing machines available. Analysts would monitor sensor activations in real time, identify patterns, calculate coordinates, and vector strike aircraft onto targets. The whole system would operate continuously, an automated surveillance network that never slept, never blinked, never missed a convoy moving in darkness. The first sensors went into production in late 1966. Testing happened at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida, where engineers simulated jungle conditions and verified that the devices could survive airdrops, detect footsteps at 50 meters, and transmit signals through vegetation. The results were promising enough to authorize deployment. What they didn't know was whether it would actually work in combat, whether the jungle would cooperate, whether the enemy would notice, whether technology designed in air-conditioned laboratories could survive the chaotic reality of war. That would be the last time anyone laughed at the sensors. Summer, 1967. The cargo bay of a C-130 Hercules at 1,500 feet, engines roaring, rear ramp open to monsoon wind and jungle stretching green and infinite below. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres braced himself against the airframe and checked the sensor dispenser one final time. Rows of ADSIDs sat in their tubes like bullets in a magazine, ready to drop at precise intervals calculated by computers back at Nakhon Phanom. The loadmaster gave the signal. Torres activated the dispenser. One by one, sensors tumbled into the slipstream, small parachutes blossoming white against green canopy before disappearing into the foliage. Every 3 seconds, another seed planted. The C-130 flew a precise grid pattern, crisscrossing suspected truck routes, creating overlapping fields of coverage. From above, the Laotian panhandle looked peaceful, untouched. The trail itself was invisible beneath the trees. That was precisely the point. If American eyes couldn't penetrate the canopy, American ears would listen through the ground itself. The drops continued for weeks, dozens of sorties, hundreds of sensors scattered across a 50-mile stretch of the trail network. The pattern was methodical. Sensors placed near known ford crossings, along ridgelines where trucks had to slow for steep grades, at trail junctions where intelligence suggested supply depots. The placement wasn't random. It was calculated, deliberate, designed to create a surveillance net that would detect movement anywhere within the kill zone. Not every sensor survived the fall. Some parachutes failed, leaving devices shattered on impact. Others landed in rivers or swamps, their electronics drowning in murky water. A few buried themselves so deep that their antennas couldn't transmit through the soil. But enough survived, enough took root, and within days of deployment, they began whispering secrets. Task Force Alpha came alive in late July. The facility at Nakhon Phanom had been transformed into something that looked more like NASA mission control than a military command post. Rows of computer terminals, wall-sized displays showing sensor locations and activation patterns, technicians with headsets monitoring radio frequencies, logging signals, feeding data into the IBM machines that would make sense of the electronic chatter. Captain Robert Sullivan had been an intelligence analyst before volunteering for the program. He understood signals intelligence, knew how to interpret radio intercepts and decode encrypted traffic. But this was different. The sensors didn't transmit voices or messages. They transmitted vibrations, frequencies, patterns of movement translated into electronic pulses. The computer did the interpretation, categorizing each activation by strength, duration, and signature. The first confirmed detection came on July 28th. Sensor string Alpha 7, positioned along Route 23 in Laos. 3 ADSIDs activated in sequence over a 12-minute period, each detecting ground vibrations consistent with wheeled vehicles. The seismic signature was unmistakable. Heavy trucks, probably loaded, moving south at approximately 15 miles per hour. Sullivan watched the data scroll across his terminal. The computer had already calculated coordinates, identified the most likely position of the convoy, and flagged it for immediate action. He picked up the phone to the Air Force liaison. 30 minutes later, an F-4 Phantom flight diverted from a scheduled mission and rolled in on the coordinates. Pilots reported secondary explosions, fires visible through the canopy, movement ceasing. Battle damage assessment would come later. But the concept had just proven itself in blood and fire. The sensors had detected an enemy they couldn't see, in jungle too thick for visual reconnaissance, and guided strike aircraft onto a target that would have otherwise passed unnoticed. It happened again 2 days later, then 4 times in the next week. The pattern was intoxicating. Sensors activated, coordinates generated, aircraft dispatched, trucks destroyed. The kill rate climbed steadily as analysts learned to interpret the signatures, distinguishing between heavy cargo trucks and lighter reconnaissance vehicles, between large convoys and small portering parties. But the jungle had its own language, and the sensors were still learning to speak it. False positives plagued the early operations. Elephants triggered ADSIDs with seismic signatures that looked disturbingly similar to trucks. Monsoon storms created acoustic noise that overwhelmed ADSIDs. Wind-fallen trees registered as vehicle movement. Water buffalo, wandering across sensor fields, generated enough vibrations to scramble the computers. The analysts adapted. They began requiring multiple sensor confirmations before calling strikes. They cross-referenced seismic activations with acoustic detections, using the combination to filter out natural phenomena. If an ADSID detected movement but the nearby ADSID heard nothing, probably an animal. If both triggered simultaneously with signatures matching known vehicle characteristics, probably a target. The learning curve was steep and occasionally bloody. Pilots died delivering sensors into defended areas. C-130 crews flew low and slow over the trail, vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire, trusting that the intelligence value justified the risk. Some aircraft came back shredded by 23mm rounds. Some didn't come back at all. Ground teams had it worse. Special operations forces began infiltrating sensor fields, planting devices by hand in areas too dangerous for airdrops. Navy SEALs, Army long-range reconnaissance patrols, Air Force combat controllers. They humped sensors through hostile territory, buried them along infiltration routes, activated them, and slipped away before North Vietnamese patrols could locate them. It was intimate work, planting bugs in the enemy's living room. Staff Sergeant Carlos Rodriguez spent 3 nights in September lying motionless in tall grass 50 meters from a truck park, placing ADSIDs every 30 meters in a semicircle around the facility. He could hear Vietnamese voices, smell diesel exhaust, see the glow of cigarettes in the darkness. His team planted 11 sensors. 7 survived long enough to transmit. Within 2 weeks, those 7 sensors detected enough truck movement to justify an arc light strike. B-52s, dropping hundreds of tons of ordnance that erased the park and everything in it. Rodriguez never knew if he'd been detected during the insertion. He just knew that the sensors worked, that the invisible fence was becoming real, that the trail was beginning to betray its secrets. By October, the sensor network covered nearly 80 miles of the Ho Chi Minh Trail's primary routes through Laos. Over 500 devices scattered across jungle that had swallowed conventional reconnaissance whole. The statistics started looking impressive. Truck kills per sortie increased by 30%. Aircraft were hitting targets they actually found rather than bombing suspected locations. The North Vietnamese logistics system, which had operated with near impunity in the darkness, was suddenly bleeding. But the sensors weren't just listening to the trail. Engineers were beginning to wonder if the same technology that detected trucks could detect something else, something smaller, quieter, and far more insidious. They were about to go underground. Corporal David Chen had never considered himself a technical person. He'd grown up on a farm in Iowa, understood machinery in practical terms, could fix a tractor engine or repair irrigation pumps. But the briefing he sat through in November 1967 felt like science fiction dressed in military jargon. The instructor, a civilian engineer from Bell Laboratories, held up an ADSID and unscrewed the casing. Inside, nestled among batteries and circuit boards, sat a device smaller than a coffee can, the geophone. Chen leaned forward, trying to understand how something so small could hear through hundreds of feet of earth. The physics were elegantly simple. Everything that moves creates vibrations. Footsteps, digging, vehicle treads crushing soil. Even heartbeats, if you're sensitive enough and close enough. Those vibrations travel through the ground as seismic waves, tiny earthquakes rippling outward from their source. The geophone detected those waves using a magnetic coil suspended on springs. When ground moved, the coil moved relative to the magnet, generating a small electrical current. That current was amplified, processed, and transmitted as a radio signal to aircraft orbiting overhead. But the real sophistication came in interpretation. A footstep creates a distinctive seismic signature, different from a truck, different from an animal. Human footfalls are rhythmic, bipedal, generating 2 impact points in quick succession. 100 men walking in formation create a pattern that looks like rolling thunder on an oscilloscope. Trucks generate continuous low-frequency vibrations, heavy and sustained. Digging produces irregular impacts, the bite of shovel into earth creating sharp spikes in the seismic record. The computer at Task Force Alpha had been taught to recognize these patterns. Engineers had recorded thousands of hours of seismic data during testing at Eglin, cataloging the signatures of different vehicles, different activities, different movement patterns. The IBM 36065 compared incoming sensor data against this library, identifying matches, calculating probabilities. When confidence exceeded 80%, it flagged the detection for human review. The discrimination wasn't perfect. An elephant walking produced seismic waves remarkably similar to a 2-ton truck. Water buffalo herds could masquerade as troop movements, but when acoustic sensors joined the conversation, false positives dropped dramatically. An ADSID detecting vibrations plus an accursed hearing engine noise meant one thing: mechanized movement. Cross-reference the speed, direction, and timing. And you could even estimate cargo weight based on how heavily the vehicle was laboring up slopes. The antenna was the final piece of genius. Early prototypes used simple whip antennas that stuck up conspicuously from the jungle floor. North Vietnamese troops spotted them within days, pulled them up, studied the technology. Engineers redesigned the antenna to look like tropical vegetation, using flexible materials that mimicked fern fronds or bamboo shoots. Some versions even included artificial leaves. From 5 feet away, they were nearly invisible. From 50 feet, they disappeared completely into the undergrowth. Chen's unit learned all this because they would be planting sensors by hand, not dropping them from aircraft. Ground emplacement allowed for precision impossible from the air. You could position a sensor directly beside a trail junction, bury it at the exact depth for optimal detection, orient the antenna for maximum signal strength. You could also get killed doing it. The real-world application came in December along the Laotian border. Chen's long-range patrol team, inserted via helicopter at dusk, humped 6 clicks through dense jungle and reached their objective just before midnight: a suspected truck route. Recent tire tracks visible in the mud, boot prints, cigarette butts still smelling of cheap tobacco. They planted 4 ADSIDs in a diamond pattern, bracketing the trail, each buried 18 inches deep, with only the camouflaged antenna protruding. Chen activated each sensor with a magnetic key, heard the faint beep confirming transmission, then covered the disturbance with dead leaves and forest debris. The whole process took 20 minutes per sensor. 20 minutes of exposure, of vulnerability, of listening for approaching footsteps while his hands worked in the dark. The team exfiltrated before dawn. 2 days later, those sensors detected a convoy, 12 trucks, moving south, heavy cargo signatures indicating full loads. F4s rolled in at first light and turned the convoy into smoke and shrapnel. Chen never saw the results, never walked the kill zone to count bodies or destroyed vehicles. But the sensor activations told the story in precise, emotionless data. Initial detection at 0243 hours. Movement rate consistent with loaded trucks navigating difficult terrain. Acoustic signatures matching diesel engines under load. Estimated convoy length based on time elapsed between first and last sensor activation. Approximately 400 meters. 38 minutes after detection, the sensors recorded massive seismic disturbances consistent with high explosive detonations, followed by secondary explosions indicating ammunition or fuel ignition. Then silence. The technology was working, but it created psychological effects nobody had anticipated. North Vietnamese troops began fearing the jungle itself. How did the Americans know? How did the bombs find them in darkness under canopy so thick that midday looked like dusk? Rumors spread among NVA units of American spies, of traitors, of supernatural surveillance. Some soldiers refused to walk certain trails, believing them cursed. Others tried sweeping routes with bamboo poles, hoping to trigger or locate the hidden sensors. The countermeasures escalated. NVA sappers began systematically searching known sensor fields, pulling up devices, moving them to false locations, or destroying them outright. They created decoy sounds, banging metal sheets to trigger acoustic sensors while real convoys moved on parallel routes. They learned that monsoon rains interfered with transmissions and scheduled critical movements during storms. But for every adapted tactic, the Americans refined their technology. By early 1968, sensors featured motion-activated batteries that only transmitted when detecting activity, extending operational life from weeks to months. Improved signal processing filtered out rainfall signatures, and the deployment density increased, creating overlapping coverage that made deception difficult. Move a sensor, and the gap in the network revealed itself immediately. The real breakthrough came when engineers paired seismic sensors with acoustic devices in what they called strings. 6 to 8 sensors deployed in a line along a known route, alternating between ADSIDs and acoustics. When a target entered the string, sensors activated in sequence like falling dominoes. The timing difference between activations revealed speed and direction. The acoustic signature confirmed vehicle type. The seismic strength indicated payload weight. Task Force Alpha could now predict not just that a convoy was moving, but where it would be in 30 minutes, what it was carrying, and how best to destroy it. The computers generated targeting packages automatically, calculating intercept points where terrain funneled traffic, where escape routes were limited, where strike aircraft would have maximum effect. Lieutenant Sullivan watched it happen in real time one January night. Sensor string Bravo 12 lit up like a Christmas tree. 15 activations in 22 minutes. Computers identified the target as a major supply convoy, probably carrying ammunition based on the heavy seismic signatures. The system calculated that the convoy would reach a narrow valley in 45 minutes, a natural choke point with steep sides and limited maneuverability. Sullivan coordinated with the Air Force. 2 flights of F-4s diverted. They reached the valley with 8 minutes to spare, set up a racetrack pattern at 15,000 feet, and waited. The sensors confirmed the convoy entering the kill zone precisely when predicted. The Phantoms rolled in, dropped their ordnance, and climbed away as the jungle erupted in flame. Battle damage assessment credited the strike with 18 trucks destroyed, significant secondary explosions, and complete disruption of that night's supply run. The sensors had done more than detect the enemy. They'd predicted his movements with mathematical precision and orchestrated his destruction with mechanical efficiency. The technology was impressive, but the tunnels presented an entirely different challenge. Early 1968, Ho Chi District. Sergeant First Class Raymond Blackwell had been a tunnel rat for 7 months, long enough to know that underground combat defied every instinct evolution had given humans. The darkness was absolute. The spaces were coffin-tight. The air tasted like death and smelled like fear. And somewhere in those passages, the enemy waited with intimate knowledge of every turn, every trap, every killing angle. Blackwell's unit had just discovered a new tunnel entrance during a sweep operation. Fresh digging, loose earth still damp. This wasn't an old complex being reused. Someone had excavated recently, probably within the last week. The question was, why, and where the tunnel led. Standard procedure involved sending a rat down with a flashlight, pistol, and blind courage. But the brass had a new idea. They wanted to try sensors, not the ADSIDs designed for surface deployment, but modified versions engineered specifically for subterranean detection. The concept made theoretical sense. Tunnel complexes weren't silent. Viet Cong lived down there, moved supplies, dug new passages. All that activity created vibrations that should propagate through the earth, just like surface movement. The practical reality was more complicated. Tunnels absorbed and dispersed seismic energy differently than open ground. The sensors needed recalibration for underground acoustics, different sensitivity thresholds, different interpretation algorithms. And deployment was a nightmare. You couldn't drop them from aircraft. You had to get close, dangerously close, and place them precisely at tunnel entrances, ventilation shafts, or suspected passage routes. Blackwell volunteered to take the first modified sensor into the Ho Chi complex. The device looked similar to a standard ADSID, but shorter, more compact, with a hardened casing designed to survive being lowered down vertical shafts or wedged into tight spaces. The antenna was a flexible wire that could be positioned for optimal transmission even in confined areas. He descended into the tunnel with the sensor strapped to his back, his .45 in one hand, flashlight in the other. 20 feet down, 30. The shaft opened into a horizontal passage barely wide enough for his shoulders. The air was thick, suffocating. He could hear his own heartbeat, feel the weight of earth pressing down from above. 50 meters in, the passage branched. This was where he'd placed the sensor. The geophone would detect anyone moving through either branch, distinguishing between normal tunnel traffic and excavation activity. Blackwell wedged the device into a notch in the tunnel wall, activated it with the magnetic key, and felt the subtle vibration confirming transmission. The antenna wire snaked back toward the entrance, positioned to reach signal receivers on the surface. He backed out slowly, every nerve screaming at the vulnerability of retreat. If the VC were watching, if they'd let him penetrate this deep deliberately, he was dead. But he emerged into daylight 40 minutes later, filthy and shaking but alive. The sensor was active. Now they'd see if it actually worked. 3 days later, it detected excavation. The seismic signature was unmistakable, the rhythmic impact of entrenching tools biting into laterite clay. The vibrations came from deep, probably 30 feet underground, extending the tunnel network in a direction that projected toward the nearby American firebase. Intelligence analysts studied the pattern and realized what was happening. The VC were tunneling beneath the base perimeter, probably planning a sapper attack from below. The firebase commander took the warning seriously. Engineers brought in ground-penetrating radar to confirm the tunnel's trajectory, then positioned demolition charges at the projected intercept point. When they detonated, the explosion collapsed 60 meters of tunnel and buried whoever had been digging it. The sensor had prevented an attack that would have killed dozens of Americans. But it also revealed a broader problem. The Ho Chi complex wasn't one tunnel. It was hundreds of interconnected passages spanning over 150 miles, multiple levels deep, with hospitals, armories, living quarters, and command centers, all hidden beneath apparently peaceful farmland. One sensor covering one junction was like trying to surveil a city by watching a single intersection. The solution was saturation. Through early 1968, tunnel sensor deployment accelerated across the Iron Triangle and other known tunnel zones. Teams lowered sensors into shafts, positioned them at ventilation holes, buried them at suspected underground routes based on intelligence and captured maps. The sensors formed a subterranean listening network, detecting movement that aerial reconnaissance and ground patrols could never observe. But the Viet Cong weren't passive targets. They adapted with cunning that bordered on genius. Sappers discovered sensors and relocated them, creating false readings that sent Americans chasing phantom targets. They flooded tunnel sections, shorting out electronics designed for humid but not aquatic environments. They created decoy sounds, banging on metal sheets deep underground to trigger sensors while actual operations proceeded elsewhere. The cat-and-mouse game intensified. American engineers waterproofed sensors, made them harder to remove without specialized tools, added tamper indicators that transmitted alerts if the device was disturbed. The VC responded by leaving sensors in place but routing tunnel traffic around them, creating dead zones in the network that made the Americans think passages were abandoned. Combined arms became essential. Sensors worked best when integrated with tunnel rats, chemical smoke deployments, and ground-penetrating radar. The sensors detected activity, narrowed the search area, identified patterns, but human intelligence confirmed what the machines suspected. Corporal James Harper spent February 1968 correlating sensor data with tunnel rat reports, building a three-dimensional map of the Ho Chi complex that showed not just where tunnels existed, but where they were actively used. The map revealed something disturbing. Massive underground movement in late January, weeks before the Tet Offensive. Sensors throughout the Iron Triangle registered sustained activity, new excavation, unusually heavy traffic. Intelligence officers noted the pattern, but struggled to interpret its meaning. Was the VC expanding the tunnel network, preparing supplies for extended siege, or staging forces for an offensive? The answer came January 31st when Tet exploded across South Vietnam. VC units emerged from tunnels throughout the region, attacking cities, bases, and government facilities with forces that had infiltrated and staged completely underground. The sensors had detected the preparation, recorded the movement, flagged the anomaly, but the sheer scale exceeded anyone's predictions. Post-Tet analysis showed that sensors had been most effective where they were densest and integrated with other intelligence. Firebase Mary Ann, ringed with tunnel sensors and monitored continuously, received advance warning of a sapper attack and repelled it with minimal casualties. Fire Support Base, Crook, with only spotty sensor coverage, was overrun because the assault force infiltrated through unmonitored tunnel segments. The lesson was clear. Sensors could detect underground threats, but only with comprehensive coverage and intelligent interpretation. Half measures created blind spots the enemy would exploit. Through 1968 and into 1969, tunnel sensor deployment evolved from experimental to standard procedure. Every major tunnel complex received sensor coverage. Engineers developed specialized deployment techniques for different soil types, different tunnel configurations, different tactical situations. The technology improved steadily. Better batteries, stronger signals, enhanced discrimination between human activity and natural ground movement. What the sensors couldn't detect proved as important as what they could. Already existing tunnels with minimal traffic remained invisible. Deep chambers where the VC stored supplies generated no seismic signature if nobody moved. Soundproofed areas, rare but present in critical command locations, absorbed vibrations before they could propagate to sensors. And the most sophisticated countermeasure of all, simply waiting. Moving only when sensors' batteries died, when coverage lapsed, when American attention focused elsewhere. The underground war remained a war of patience and deception. The sensors had tilted the advantage toward the Americans, made the tunnels less of a sanctuary, forced the VC to move more carefully and operate less freely. But they hadn't eliminated the threat. They'd only made it more cautious, more calculating, more aware that even Earth itself might betray secrets. Blackwell went down dozens more times through 1968, each insertion carrying sensors deeper into the labyrinth. He never got comfortable with it, never stopped feeling the primal terror of confined spaces and invisible enemies. But he understood the mission. Every sensor planted was one less place the VC could hide, one less route they could use freely, one less advantage they held in a war fought as much below ground as above it. By late 1968, over 2,000 tunnel sensors were active across the three-core tactical zone. They formed a subterranean surveillance network unprecedented in warfare. And while the tunnels remained the VC's greatest tactical advantage, they were no longer invisible sanctuaries. But the trail remained the primary battlefield, and the sensors were evolving. Late 1968, Task Force Alpha had been operational for over a year, and the analysts at Nakhon Phanom had compiled enough data to answer the question that mattered most. Was it working? The statistics painted a complex picture. Major Stephen Kovacs reviewed the numbers on a November morning, watching rainwater sheet down the operations center windows. Over 20,000 sensors deployed along the Ho Chi Minh Trail network, approximately 12,000 still functional and transmitting. Those 12,000 devices had generated 847,000 activations since January. The computers had filtered those activations down to 31,000 probable targets. Strike aircraft had responded to 8,400 of those targets, constrained by weather, availability, and tactical priorities. Confirmed truck kills, 2,116. Probable kills, another 4,800 based on secondary explosions and post-strike reconnaissance. The interdiction rate had climbed from roughly 15% before sensors to nearly 40% with full coverage. Sortie efficiency had doubled. Aircraft were hitting real targets instead of suspected locations, expending ordnance on enemy logistics instead of empty jungle. But the supplies still flowed. That was the maddening reality. Despite destroying thousands of trucks, despite making the trail a gauntlet of electronic surveillance and precision strikes, the North Vietnamese continued moving enough material south to sustain operations. They'd adapted, dispersed routes, increased porter traffic on foot trails too narrow for sensors to effectively monitor, moved during weather that grounded aircraft, accepted the losses as acceptable cost of maintaining the war. Operation Muscle Shoals represented the attempt to tilt those calculations decisively. The concept was ambitious: create concentrated sensor fields so dense that nothing could move through them undetected, then maintain continuous air coverage over those kill boxes. Total surveillance leading to total interdiction. The Mujia Pass became the test case, a critical choke point where Route 23 squeezed through mountainous terrain, funneling traffic into a valley barely 3 kilometers wide. Engineers seeded the area with sensors at unprecedented density. One ADSID every 30 meters, a COWSIDs interspersed for acoustic confirmation. Backup sensors positioned to detect attempts at bypassing the main route. The result was the electronic net so fine that a squad moving on foot would trigger multiple confirmations. The air component was equally intensive. AC-130 Spectre gunships orbited the kill box nightly, their side-firing cannons able to engage any target the sensors detected. During daylight, F-4s maintained station, ready to respond within minutes. Forward air controllers loitered overhead in OV-10 Broncos, coordinating strikes, assessing damage, ensuring continuous pressure. For 3 weeks in December 1968, Muscle Shoals demonstrated what total interdiction could achieve. Sensor activation spiked as convoys entered the kill box. Aircraft responded immediately. The valley became a graveyard of burning trucks, cratered roads, and secondary explosions that sometimes lasted for hours as ammunition and fuel cooked off. The kill rate exceeded 90%. Nearly every vehicle detected was engaged and destroyed. Reconnaissance photos showed the pass littered with wreckage, the road impassable, the logistics flow effectively severed. Intelligence intercepts recorded North Vietnamese commanders ordering routes abandoned, convoys halted, alternative paths sought. It was working, and it was unsustainable. The air assets required for continuous coverage exceeded what the Air Force could maintain long-term. Weather eventually grounded aircraft, opening gaps in the coverage. The North Vietnamese simply waited, then surged traffic through during the breaks. Within a month, supplies were moving again, the wreckage pushed aside, new routes bulldozed around the worst cratering. The cost-benefit analysis troubled Kovacs. Muscle Shoals had consumed thousands of hours of flight time, tens of thousands of rounds of ammunition, hundreds of tons of bombs. The fuel alone cost millions. The sensors themselves, even mass-produced, ran a $1,000 to $2,000 per unit. The computer infrastructure, the aircraft, the personnel, the logistics of maintaining Task Force Alpha, all of it added up to a program exceeding $1.7 billion by conservative estimates. Against that, estimated damage inflicted on North Vietnamese logistics, trucks destroyed, supplies interdicted, replacement costs. The calculations suggested the sensors were cost-effective, that each dollar spent destroyed $3 to $5 of enemy material. But those calculations assumed the North Vietnamese valued trucks the same way Americans did, that the war could be won through economic attrition of their logistics network. History was proving that assumption wrong. The North received trucks from China and the Soviet Union, absorbed losses that would have crippled Western militaries, and continued prosecuting the war with determination that defied economic logic. The sensors could count kills but couldn't measure will. McNamara's line represented the most ambitious sensor deployment of the war, and its failure illustrated the technology's limitations. The concept emerged in 1967. Create a barrier of sensors across the demilitarized zone separating North and South Vietnam, an electronic fence that would detect any infiltration and trigger immediate response. It would be Muscle Shoals extended across 160 kilometers of jungle, mountain, and coastal plain. The deployment began in late 1967 and continued through 1968. Thousands of sensors, supporting infrastructure including watchtowers, fire support bases, and dedicated quick reaction forces. The barrier would make crossing the DMZ so costly that the North would be forced to rely entirely on the longer, more vulnerable trail routes through Laos. It never worked as envisioned. The terrain was too varied, too difficult, jungle so thick that sensors couldn't reliably detect movement, mountains where signals bounced and scattered, creating ghost readings, coastal areas where weather and saltwater corroded electronics faster than they could be replaced. The North Vietnamese studied the barrier, identified gaps, and infiltrated through them with impunity. The quick reaction forces couldn't respond fast enough. By the time sensors detected infiltrators and American units scrambled, the enemy had already crossed and disappeared into sanctuaries south of the DMZ. The barrier became a resource drain, tying down troops for static defense, while the real infiltration happened through Laos. But the trail itself, the original focus of sensor deployment, continued delivering results. Not decisive results, not war-winning results, but consistent degradation of enemy logistics that forced adaptation and consumed resources. Kovacs believed the program was succeeding within its capabilities, failing only against expectations that had been unrealistic from the start. The success stories accumulated throughout 1969. A March engagement where sensors detected an ammunition convoy near Savannah, Laos. F-4s responded within 20 minutes. The resulting explosions were visible from Thailand, shaking the ground hard enough to register on seismographs. Intelligence estimated 200 tons of ammunition, destroyed in a single strike that cost the lives of 2 enemy truck drivers and eliminated supplies that would have sustained a regiment for weeks. July brought interdiction of a POL convoy, petroleum products desperately needed by mechanized units in the south. Sensors tracked the trucks through 3 nights of movement, analysts predicting their route with enough accuracy that Air Force planners pre-positioned assets. The convoy walked into an ambush of cluster bombs and napalm that incinerated fuel trucks and created fires that burned for 2 days. September saw a major supply depot discovered through pattern analysis of sensor activations. Trucks converged on a location showing no surface indications of infrastructure, but the concentration of traffic suggested a cache point. B-52s from Guam struck the coordinates on speculation. Secondary explosions confirmed vast underground storage, rice and ammunition enough for months of operations, all destroyed because sensors revealed what aerial photography had missed. These engagements represented the sensors at their best, not replacing human intelligence but augmenting it, not achieving impossible omniscience, but providing real-time tactical data that shifted odds in American favor. The technology worked within its limitations, and those limitations were becoming well understood. The North Vietnamese adaptation accelerated through 1969 and 1970. They dispersed truck parks, never concentrating enough vehicles to justify B-52 strikes. They moved in smaller groups, sometimes single trucks with hours between departures, reducing the signature that sensors could detect. They improved camouflage discipline, parking only in triple canopy areas where sensors struggled to differentiate vehicles from natural movement. They also turned the sensors against their creators. Captured devices were studied, reverse engineered, their capabilities and vulnerabilities documented. The NVA learned sensor battery life, planned major movements for periods when coverage would be degraded. They learned transmission frequencies, occasionally used jammers to create electronic noise that overwhelmed receivers. They learned detection ranges, positioned decoy traffic just outside those ranges to draw aircraft away from actual convoys moving through gaps in coverage. The war was changing, and the sensors were about to face their greatest test, January 1968, 23 days before Tet. The sensor network along the DMZ and throughout the trail lit up with activity that defied normal patterns. Captain Sullivan watched the displays at Task Force Alpha with growing unease. The volume of movement was unprecedented, hundreds of activations daily, convoys moving with unusual urgency, trail segments that had been quiet for months suddenly showing sustained traffic. The computers flagged the anomaly automatically, statistical deviation beyond 3 standard deviations from baseline. Something was happening, something big. Sullivan compiled the data into intelligence reports, highlighted the patterns, sent warnings up the chain of command. His analysis suggested major offensive preparation, possibly coordinated attacks across multiple fronts. The reports reached Saigon. Analysts there noted the warnings, cross-referenced them with other intelligence, and reached ambiguous conclusions. Yes, enemy activity was elevated, but it always increased before traditional Vietnamese holidays. Tet, the Lunar New Year, was approaching. The spike might represent nothing more than troops moving home for celebration, supplies being pre-positioned for routine operations, normal logistical activity magnified by the holiday. The scale worried Sullivan. The sensors were detecting movement consistent with division-level deployments. That wasn't troops going home. That was an army moving into position. But he was a captain analyzing electronic data in Thailand. The generals in Saigon had broader intelligence pictures, human sources. Strategic context he lacked. He filed his reports and watched the sensors continue screaming warnings nobody seemed to hear. January 30th. Sensor activations peaked. Networks around major cities showed massive infiltration. Tunnel sensors throughout the 3 Corps registered sustained underground movement. The pattern was unmistakable now, hours before the offensive would begin. Enemy forces were in position, staged for coordinated attacks across South Vietnam. Tet exploded at 0130. Hours on January 31st. Viet Cong and NVA units struck over 100 cities and towns simultaneously. Saigon, Hue, Da, Nang. American bases throughout the country. The coordination was stunning, the ferocity unexpected, the psychological impact devastating. The enemy that was supposed to be losing, that body count suggested was being ground down through attrition, had just demonstrated the capacity for offensive operations on a scale that shocked American leadership. The sensors had detected it. The data was there, recorded, time-stamped, unambiguous. But detecting and interpreting were different skills, and predicting required belief that such an offensive was possible. The intelligence failure wasn't technological, it was human. Post-Tet, sensor deployment evolved rapidly. The networks that had focused primarily on the trail expanded throughout South Vietnam. Sensors ringed cities, monitored approaches to major bases, covered infiltration routes from Cambodia and Laos. The technology that had been experimental became standard. Deployed wherever American forces needed early warning of enemy movement. Firebase monitoring became critical. Isolated American positions, often in remote areas, were vulnerable to massed assaults that could overrun defenses before reinforcements arrived. Sensors provided the early warning that meant the difference between preparation and annihilation. Fire Support Base. Ripcord received sensor coverage in March 1968, a ring of ADSIDs and ACAUSIDs positioned along likely enemy approach routes. April 3rd, 0200 hours. The sensors detected movement, not the random activations of foraging animals or weather effects, but the systematic progression of multiple targets converging on the firebase from 3 directions. The signature suggested infantry, possibly battalion strength, moving with tactical discipline. The firebase commander, Captain Thomas Willoughby, received the warning with 20 minutes of lead time, 20 minutes to wake troops, man fighting positions, call for artillery support, and request helicopter gunships. When the NVA assault began, it struck prepared defenses instead of sleeping soldiers. The attack was repelled with heavy enemy casualties and minimal American losses. Willoughby credited the sensors with saving his command. Without them, the attack would have achieved complete surprise. With them, the advantage shifted decisively toward the defenders. The pattern repeated across I Corps through 1968. Sensors detecting night movement, commanders responding, assaults blunted before they could achieve momentum. Khe Sanh became the most famous sensor success of the war. The combat base sat in northwestern Quang Tri province, isolated, surrounded, under siege by 2 NVA divisions beginning in January 1968. The siege lasted 77 days, a brutal test of American firepower against North Vietnamese determination. Sensors played a crucial role in the defense. Over 300 sensors ringed the base, creating overlapping fields of coverage that detected every enemy approach. NVA troops attempting to infiltrate through wire were detected before reaching the perimeter. Sapper teams trying to dig approach trenches triggered sensors that called in artillery. Supply convoys attempting to reinforce besieging forces were tracked from Laos and destroyed before reaching their destinations. The siege became a killing ground where American artillery and air power, guided by sensor intelligence, inflicted catastrophic casualties on attackers who couldn't approach without detection. Estimates suggest 10,000 to 15,000 NVA killed around Khe Sanh, many of them identified and targeted through sensor data that revealed concentrations invisible to aerial reconnaissance. The tactical success was undeniable. The strategic meaning remained debatable. Khe Sanh held, but at enormous cost in resources and attention. The siege tied down significant American forces and consumed massive amounts of ammunition and supplies. Whether it represented American victory or mutual exhaustion depended on perspective. Through 1969 and into 1970, sensor deployment continued expanding. The technology improved with each generation. Batteries lasted longer, up to 6 months in optimal conditions. Signal processing became more sophisticated, better at filtering false positives, more accurate at target classification. New sensor variants appeared, including cowboy devices that could float in rivers, detecting boat traffic along waterways the VC used for infiltration. The A Shau Valley received concentrated sensor coverage in 1969, a remote region near the Laosian border that served as a major infiltration corridor. The valley had been an NVA sanctuary for years, too remote and heavily defended for sustained American presence. Sensors changed that equation. Without occupying the valley, Americans could monitor it, detect movement through it, and strike forces attempting to use it. Major operations like Dewey Canyon and Apache Snow used sensor intelligence to locate enemy base areas, track unit movements, and coordinate multi-battalion assaults. The sensors didn't guarantee tactical success, but they provided targeting information that made operations more effective and casualties more sustainable. The expansion created its own problems. More sensors meant more data. The computers at Task Force Alpha processed thousands of activations daily. Analysts struggled to separate significant patterns from background noise. The system that had seemed elegant when monitoring the trail became overwhelming when applied across an entire theater of war. Automation helped, but couldn't replace human judgment. Computers flagged probable targets based on algorithms, but decisions about committing aircraft, artillery, or ground forces required assessment of tactical context the machines couldn't provide. An activation pattern that meant imminent attack in one location might represent normal traffic in another. The technology provided information. Commanders still made decisions. By 1970, the sensor network in Southeast Asia represented the most extensive battlefield surveillance system ever deployed. Over 30,000 devices scattered across Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, supporting infrastructure worth billions. Thousands of personnel dedicated to monitoring, analyzing, and responding to sensor intelligence. It was a technological marvel, a glimpse of future warfare, where electronics replaced human observation. But it was also an American marvel, dependent on American resources, American technical sophistication, American willingness to fund and maintain such complexity. The war was Vietnamizing, transferring responsibility to South Vietnamese forces who lacked the infrastructure, training, and institutional culture to sustain sensor operations at American scale. The sensors had transformed tactical intelligence. They'd made the Ho Chi Minh Trail more dangerous, tunnel networks less secure, isolated firebases more defensible. They demonstrated that electronics could detect what humans couldn't see, that computers could process patterns too complex for individual analysis, that technology could shift battlefield advantage. What they couldn't do was win wars. That required strategy, political will, and sustainable commitment. By 1970, the jungle was speaking clearly through thousands of electronic voices, but Washington had stopped listening. 71. Task Force Alpha. Technical Sergeant Michael Reeves watched his terminal go dark for the third time that week. Not a system failure, not a power outage, just another sensor field dying as batteries expired and replacement deployments ceased. The display that had once shown thousands of active sensors across the trail network now showed gaps, blind spots, coverage zones that had once been solid, now dissolving into silence. Vietnamization had sounded reasonable in Washington briefings. Transition responsibility to South Vietnamese forces, reduce American presence, allow ARVN to assume the burden of their own defense. The policy had momentum, political necessity, the weight of domestic opposition to the war behind it. What it didn't have was practical acknowledgement that sensor operations required infrastructure South Vietnam couldn't replicate. The computers alone represented technology beyond ARVN capability. The IBM 360-65 systems required specialized maintenance, climate-controlled facilities, and technicians trained in data processing far beyond what South Vietnamese military schools provided. The Air Force personnel who monitored transmissions, interpreted patterns, and coordinated strike responses represented years of training and institutional knowledge impossible to transfer quickly. Most critically, the sensors themselves required continuous replacement. Battery life limited operational duration. Monsoons corroded electronics. Enemy action destroyed or relocated devices. Maintaining coverage meant constant resupply. Deployment missions that required aircraft, trained crews, and logistical support systems. The South Vietnamese Air Force lacked the transport capacity, the sensor inventory, and the tactical doctrine to sustain operations at American scale. Captain Nguyen Van Thieu had been trained by Americans at Task Force Alpha, spent 6 months learning sensor operations, and understood both the technology's power and the impossibility of maintaining it after American withdrawal. He'd watched the sensor network deliver tactical intelligence that saved lives, detected threats, enabled strikes that would have been impossible through conventional reconnaissance. He'd also watched American logistics sustain the system through sheer industrial capacity South Vietnam couldn't match. By late 1971, the sensor network was collapsing through neglect. Not deliberate abandonment, but the natural entropy of unmaintained technology. Batteries died, transmissions ceased, coverage gaps widened. The trail that had been monitored with near-constant surveillance began reverting to the invisible highway it had been before sensors. The intelligence loss was immediate and severe. Truck traffic increased along routes that had been too dangerous for daylight movement. Supply flow accelerated as the NVA recognized that electronic surveillance was degrading. Convoys that would have been detected and destroyed 6 months earlier now moved with impunity through coverage gaps that once hadn't existed. American commanders still, in-country, watched the deterioration with frustration. They requested sensor resupply, got excuses about budgets and policy priorities. They proposed training programs for ARVN personnel, encountered resistance from South Vietnamese leadership, who viewed sensor operations as American responsibility. The technology that had seemed like a permanent battlefield advantage revealed itself as utterly dependent on continuous American involvement. The final major sensor-directed operations came during the 1972 Easter Offensive. North Vietnamese forces, emboldened by reduced American presence, launched a conventional invasion across the DMZ. The remaining sensor networks detected the massive movement, provided early warning, guided airstrikes that blunted but couldn't halt the offensive. Linebacker operations. The intensive bombing campaigns of 1972 used surviving sensors to target logistics and troop concentrations. The effectiveness had diminished but not disappeared. Aircraft still found targets, strikes still inflicted damage. The sensors still whispered secrets through failing batteries and degraded coverage. But it was a shadow of what the network had achieved at its peak. By 1973, when the Paris Peace Accords formalized American withdrawal, Task Force Alpha was already winding down. The computers kept processing diminishing data from sensor fields that existed more on maps than in functioning reality. Technicians prepared to abandon facilities that had housed billions of dollars of equipment and years of accumulated expertise. Thousands of sensors remained in place, scattered across Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. Some still transmitted, their signals reaching receivers that nobody monitored. Others had already failed, their batteries exhausted, their electronics corroded, their antennas broken. They sat in jungle that was slowly reclaiming them. Camouflaged vegetation becoming real vegetation as vines, grew over the artificial ferns and bamboo shoots. The NVA overran old sensor fields in 1974 and 1975 as they advanced toward final victory. Troops discovered the devices, studied them with curiosity and respect. Some were shipped to Hanoi for technical analysis. Soviet advisors examined American electronics, noted design features, assessed capabilities. The sensors that had once been secret weapons became historical artifacts before the war even ended. What happened to Task Force Alpha personnel varied. Some rotated home to normal assignments, carrying classified knowledge of operations they couldn't discuss. Others transitioned to new programs applying sensor technology elsewhere. A few stayed in Southeast Asia until the bitter end, watching South Vietnam collapse while maintaining surveillance networks that no longer mattered. Captain Sullivan left in December 1972, his tour complete, his faith in technology's ability to win wars permanently damaged. He'd spent 4 years watching sensors detect the enemy with remarkable precision, guide strikes with increasing effectiveness, accumulate statistics that suggested progress. None of it had prevented the outcome that was becoming inevitable. The sensors had counted trucks destroyed, supplies interdicted, enemy movements detected. They couldn't measure determination, political will, or the simple fact that the other side was willing to absorb losses and continue fighting. Sergeant Reeves was among the last Americans out of Nakhon Phanom in early 1975. He shut down systems methodically, following procedures for equipment that would be abandoned or transferred to Thai control. The displays went dark one by one, the computers powered down. The facility that had once hummed with activity and purpose fell silent. He walked through empty corridors, remembering the intensity of operations, the sense that technology was providing decisive advantage, the belief that electronic surveillance would tip the balance. The memories felt hollow now. The sensors had worked. The war had been lost anyway. Legacy captured became the North Vietnamese term for sensor technology they recovered. The devices represented Western technical sophistication, capitalist industrial capacity, American belief that problems could be solved through engineering excellence. They also represented limitations. Technology dependent on batteries would always fail eventually. Electronics requiring maintenance would degrade without support. Systems demanding specialized infrastructure couldn't survive in austere conditions. The NVA studied those lessons carefully. They'd adapted to sensor surveillance throughout the war, learned its capabilities and vulnerabilities, developed countermeasures and tactics. The captured sensors became teaching tools, examples of how determined forces could overcome technological disadvantage through patience, adaptation, and acceptance of costs the enemy wouldn't tolerate. For tunnel rats like Raymond Blackwell, the sensor program's collapse felt personal. He'd risked his life planting devices underground, trusting that the intelligence they provided justified the danger. He'd crawled through darkness placing sensors that detected threats and saved lives. Knowing those sensors now sat abandoned or in enemy hands, their batteries dead, their mission terminated, felt like betrayal of the risks taken to deploy them. The human element remained the most troubling aspect. Analysts who'd spent years interpreting sensor data, learning the patterns, developing expertise in electronic warfare. Pilots who'd flown strikes against coordinates generated by sensor intelligence. Ground troops who'd benefited from early warnings and tactical advantage the sensors provided. All of them watching the system collapse not through enemy action, but through policy decisions made in Washington. The sensors had seen the war's beginning and its end, detected the enemy's strength, and witnessed American withdrawal. They'd transformed tactical intelligence, demonstrated technological possibilities, glimpsed future warfare, and they'd failed to prevent defeat, unable to compensate for strategic failures, political exhaustion, and determination imbalance. By April 1975, when North Vietnamese tanks rolled into Saigon, most sensors deployed during the war had already failed, their batteries exhausted, their transmissions silent, their mission complete and their war lost. They remained in the jungle, monuments to technological ambition and strategic insufficiency, slowly being absorbed by the earth they'd once taught to speak. But their story wasn't over. The NGSQ-187, remotely monitored battlefield sensor system, entered service with the US Army in 1991, just in time for Desert Storm. It looked nothing like the Vietnam-era ADSIDs, sleeker and more sophisticated, powered by lithium batteries that lasted years instead of months, transmitting digital signals instead of analog pulses. But the conceptual DNA was unmistakable: unattended ground sensors, detecting enemy movement and relaying intelligence to command. Centers for immediate action. The Gulf War demonstrated what Vietnam's sensor network had promised but never quite achieved: technological dominance translating into battlefield victory. Coalition forces seeded the Iraqi desert with sensors that detected Republican Guard movements, tracked supply convoys, and provided early warning of attacks that never materialized because the enemy recognized they were already detected. The sensors worked perfectly in terrain that cooperated, against an enemy that couldn't adapt fast enough, within a war that lasted weeks instead of years. Every American conflict since has employed sensor technology descended from Igloo White: Afghanistan, Iraq again, Syria. The devices evolved dramatically. Modern unattended ground sensors use seismic, acoustic, magnetic, and infrared detection. They transmit via satellite instead of aircraft relay. They incorporate artificial intelligence that can distinguish between civilian traffic and military movement, between friendly forces and enemy combatants. The technology that seemed revolutionary in 1967 became routine by the 21st century. Border monitoring adopted sensor networks wholesale. The US-Mexico border, the DMZ between North and South Korea, international boundaries throughout contested regions worldwide. The same principles applied. Detect movement, classify targets, alert responders. The sensors that couldn't seal the Ho Chi Minh Trail now guard borders with reasonable effectiveness, sufficient resources, and realistic expectations about what technology can achieve. Battlefield awareness systems integrated sensors into broader networks. Drones, satellites, signals, intelligence, human observation. The lesson from Vietnam was clear. Sensors provided valuable data, but couldn't operate in isolation. They worked best as one input among many, augmenting rather than replacing human intelligence. The analysts at Task Force Alpha had learned that lesson expensively. Modern doctrine started with it as foundational principle. What worked from the Vietnam sensor program became doctrine. Automated detection reduced the burden on human observers. Networked sensors provided redundancy and confirmation that single-point observation couldn't achieve. Data fusion, combining electronic surveillance with other intelligence sources, created situational awareness impossible through any single method. Rapid strike coordination, vectoring forces onto detected targets before they could disperse or escape. These concepts, proven in Southeast Asian jungles, now define modern warfare. Every American combat vehicle carries sensors. Every firebase deploys detection networks. Every area of operations gets surveilled electronically before troops enter. The technology has become so integrated into military operations that its absence would be tactically crippling. What failed provides equally important lessons. Technology cannot substitute for strategy. The sensors detected enemy movements with remarkable accuracy, but couldn't answer why the war was being fought or whether the objective was achievable. They provided tactical advantage in a conflict where strategic purpose remained contested. Brilliant execution of flawed strategy still produces failure. Enemy adaptation is inevitable. The NVA learned to work around sensors, developed countermeasures, accepted losses, and persisted. Modern adversaries do the same. Stealth technology, electronic warfare, decoys and deception. The sensors evolved, the countermeasures evolved. The cycle continues. Technological advantage is temporary. Adversaries learn. Political will matters more than technical capability. The sensors worked as designed, achieved their operational objectives, demonstrated their value. The war was lost anyway because domestic support collapsed. Political commitment wavered, and the enemy proved willing to sustain the fight longer than America was willing to prosecute it. Technology can win battles. It cannot manufacture determination. The moral questions persist. Warfare becoming remote, automated, directed by computers processing electronic signals from devices that reduce human enemies to seismic signatures and acoustic patterns. The psychological distance from killing that sensors enabled. Strikes ordered against coordinates rather than visible targets. Death delivered without personal confrontation. Vietnam's sensors were primitive compared to modern autonomous weapons, but they pioneered the ethical territory we're still navigating. Colonel James Kozlowski, retired, reflected on these questions 50 years after that patrol through Tay Ninh province. He'd fought in a war where the enemy was maddeningly invisible, had embraced technology that promised to solve that problem, and watched it succeed tactically while failing strategically. His perspective had mellowed with time, but not softened. The sensors were remarkable, he'd say when asked. They detected what humans couldn't see, processed patterns too complex for individual analysis, enabled strikes that saved American lives. They also created false confidence that technology could compensate for strategic incoherence, that surveillance could replace understanding, that killing enemy soldiers efficiently would somehow produce victory. Captain Sullivan, also retired, taught military intelligence at the Army War College. He used Task Force Alpha as a case study in both the power and limitations of technical intelligence. Students learned about the sensors' capabilities, studied their deployment, analyzed their effectiveness. They also learned that the most sophisticated surveillance network in history hadn't prevented intelligence failure before Tet, hadn't detected the erosion of political will that doomed American strategy, hadn't answered the fundamental question of whether the war's objectives justified its costs. Former tunnel rat Raymond Blackwell rarely spoke about Vietnam. The memories were too dark, too intimate, too weighted with survivors' guilt and moral ambiguity. But he acknowledged that sensors had saved lives, including possibly his own. The devices he'd planted in Ho Chi tunnels had detected threats and prevented attacks. That mattered, even if the larger war was lost. Individual lives saved retained meaning even within strategic failure. The paradox endured. The sensors represented American technical brilliance applied to warfare, innovation driven by necessity, engineering excellence solving tactical problems with elegant effectiveness. They also represented limitations that technology couldn't overcome. Machines could detect the enemy, but couldn't explain why he fought. Electronics could count trucks destroyed, but couldn't measure determination. Computers could process data, but couldn't generate wisdom. Modern militaries understand this better than their Vietnam-era predecessors. Sensors are tools, not solutions. Technology enables but doesn't replace human judgment. Electronic surveillance provides information, not victory. The lessons purchased expensively in Southeast Asian jungles now inform doctrine, shape training, temper expectations about what technology can achieve. The sensors themselves occasionally resurface. Hikers in Laos discover corroded cylinders half buried in forest soil. Camouflaged antennas still vaguely resembling vegetation after 50 years of weathering. Bomb disposal teams find them during unexploded ordnance clearance, harmless but requiring identification and proper handling. Collectors prize them as Cold War artifacts, relics of a war fought partially through electronics. One such sensor sits in the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, displayed alongside other Vietnam-era technology. The placard explains its function, notes its historical significance, mentions Operation Igloo White and Task Force Alpha. Visitors glance at it briefly before moving on to more dramatic exhibits. Fighter aircraft, missiles, technology that looks like what warfare is supposed to be. But that small green cylinder represents something profound about modern conflict. The battlefield becoming electronic. Warfare conducted through sensors and computers as much as rifles and bombs. The future arriving in jungle clearings and tunnel complexes. Imperfect and incomplete, but unmistakably transformative. In 2023, a former Special Forces soldier hiking through Quang Tri province discovered a sensor still embedded where it had been planted in 1968. The antenna had long since broken off. The casing was corroded, the batteries dead for decades, the electronics salvageable only as scrap. He photographed it carefully, left it undisturbed, and posted the image online. The responses came from veterans who'd deployed sensors, analysts who'd monitored them, pilots who'd struck targets they'd detected, old men remembering young wars, technology that had seemed cutting edge now appearing primitive, missions that had felt urgent now seeming distant and almost incomprehensible. The sensor had outlasted the war it was designed for, survived the peace that followed, and endured as silent witness to ambitions that exceeded achievement. The jungle had reclaimed it slowly, patiently, the way the jungle reclaims everything given sufficient time. Vines had grown around the casing, soil had built up against its sides, nature had absorbed the technology meant to reveal her secrets, made it part of herself again, demonstrated that ultimately the Earth keeps what the Earth takes. 55 years after deployment, that sensor rested exactly where it had landed, its mission long complete, its war long over, its purpose transformed from tactical intelligence to historical artifact. It had detected enemy movements, transmitted their locations, enabled their destruction. It had whispered secrets through the ground, taught dirt to speak, made the invisible visible for a war that was lost anyway. The irony wasn't lost on those who'd believed in the technology. They'd created sensors that worked perfectly, deployed them effectively, used them successfully, and none of it had been enough. The machines had done everything asked of them. The war had demanded more than machines could provide. For more stories of Vietnam's forgotten technologies and the soldiers who wielded them, subscribe to our channel.